Hi, I'm Donna Murphy from the Braver Angels Film Club, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion of A Tale of Three Chinatowns. Our other film club leaders here tonight are Ivan Kaysen, Molly Zeff, Ron McFarland. Now, in addition to the three Chinatowns in the U.S. that this movie discusses in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Boston, there are others. So Ivan from Hawaii has been to the one in Honolulu. Monterey Park, California is known as the first suburban Chinatown. I'd like to take a moment of silence to remember the 11 people recently killed in Monterey Park. So let's start with a few Braver Angels ground rules. We're here to understand others and to explain our views, not to convince anyone to change their mind. We will take turns, not interrupt others, listen to everyone, open up space for quieter group members, and be respectful. In other words, we bring our best selves to the discussion. When you wish to talk, please raise your electronic hand, which you should see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll call on you. Our film club leaders will now take turns asking you questions about A Tale of Three Chinatowns. Ron, please start us off.
Yes, good evening. The first question is what is your emotional response to this documentary? What is your emotional response to this documentary? Or do you have an emotional response to this documentary? And you can raise your hand, and if you need clarity from Ron, I'll take
Marlene. Marlene, go for it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Filipino American, but when I went to UCSD, University of California, San Diego, I was active in being a founder of the Asian American Student Alliance, which included my best friend, Phyllis Chu from Ocean, New Jersey, and my other friend, Ida Lucero from San Diego as well. So I've been in the Asian American movement even in high school, so I'm 71 years old. So watching this video of three Chinatowns, I'm just grateful to have any history of Asian Americans out there. And I definitely have a lot of comments about what they showed, but I am grateful that they highlighted I think most Americans know New York, LA, San Francisco are the big ones, and I lived in Chicago for 10 years. So I had a great time in Cermak Street and eating Chinese food. And so, yeah, Chicago, Washington, DC, Boston, that was really great for me to get that history as well.
So it sounds like you had a happy response initially that we are showing this documentary, and then at the same time, you were really happy that we're focusing on your community. Is that correct?
Well, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely concerned about what's happened, but my initial response is, wow, we're getting play on history of Asian Americans. But yeah, no, there's a lot to discuss.
All right, Marlene, that's great. Anybody else that I'm not missing would like to respond to that question? You're emotional.
Annie.
I thought it was very interesting. I don't know very much about Chinatowns. I don't have that much experience with it. So I thought this was really interesting. They talked about the gentrification, which that's happened everywhere. I mean, that happens all over the place. I've seen it. And then, in the 70s, people moved out, and then their children decided to come back in. So it was very interesting to see that some of it was working out better than others. You saw how sometimes there was some people that the gentrification, the people who lived there couldn't afford to live there anymore. They were outpriced, so they kind of were pushed out. And so luckily there was one lady that was in shock, and she had I think 3 children, and luckily she was able to find some living. So that was sad to see that. I mean, but that's a thing that happens, and it's a kind of a reality with all kinds of groups of people. You go, oh, it's so nice they're fixing up the city that's so bad, and then they make it nicer, but it pushes people out. So how do you handle that? And it's a problem with all kinds of areas. And I'm from Cleveland, as I said, And some of these areas, oh, they were so bad, and then they go and fix them up and say, that's great, but what happens to these people? There's not a practical solution. There's different ways to work on it, but it does bring up another problem. That's an ongoing problem.
Thank you,
And
Anna.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you kind of had like a mixed feeling on it, but
Yeah. I mean, it was pretty much what I expected to see. When you've got these ethnic areas, that is what happens. And you don't like to see them just go away. You don't like to see them go bad. So in order to bring them up, people put all this money in and then people lose their homes. So it's kind of a, how do you fix that? How do you fix that? There's not an easy answer to it.
All right, thank you very much. The next hand I see is Catherine. How about you? Take yourself off. There you go, Catherine.
Yeah, I had, well, it was good to watch the show to see this coverage of the Chinatowns. I watched with my spouse of 40 years who is Chinese, and her father immigrated from China. So she grew up here, and she grew up in DC and was familiar with Chinatown there. The two of us had lived in Chicago in the 80s, and so knew Chinatown in Chicago. And then our oldest daughter is adopted from China, and we used to travel back to DC to see Lily's family and stop in Chinatown in Chicago as a family routine, but we haven't done that for at least 10 years. And so we were happy to know the Chicago Chinatown is thriving. We're concerned about what we saw in DC. We hadn't really stopped by there recently. So a lot of us, it was like nostalgia or catch up or here's our old stomping grounds, as sort of a personal reaction. And we were glad, to see a program about Chinatown, and stories of what it is to be Chinese in America. But yes, then there was also a lot of issues that came up as well. So sort of a mixed of, oh, look, yay, like here's a mirror for, certainly for my spouse and me as her family and our daughter, and then concern about what's actually happening in the different cities. We were glad to hear Chicago's doing well and want to get there soon to check it out, since we haven't been there in so long.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Judith, how about you? You're on mute, Judith.
Yeah, the emotional part for me was not so much about Chinatown, but these people who, across the board, whatever city they're living in, have this commonality of a gentility, a respect, a pride in their families, their communities, quiet, hardworking. And the idea that these people are persecuted is really upsetting to me. There's, nothing egregious about them. They're just a lovely group of people. And it's just hard to absorb. It's hard to understand.
Yeah, I sometimes I can relate, but but we can't relate when we're not in those type of shoes. And so, yeah, thank you. I heard respect, I heard pride, gentility. Yeah, thank you. Hopefully some of those questions and answers, we will get a nice conversation going on it. Thank you very much, Judith. Anyone else on that particular question?
Well, why don't we move on to Molly's question now?
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. This is similar. We zeroed in on a certain kind of reaction, but since, well, let's put it this way, since some of this film was certainly not known to at least a few of us on this call, maybe several of us, even though we haven't heard from everyone, I was wondering what was completely new to you, or maybe what was surprising. So new or surprising. Obviously, this was a completely different topic, I will say, than we've ever found for one of our previous movies or documentaries. Yeah, go for it, Liz.
I guess I'm going to say what was surprising was how unsurprising it was, in the sense that so many of the threads paralleled what has happened to Blacks who were redlined, and then interstates or other urban development stuff destroyed their neighborhoods. I mean, that that at some level, I kind of expected to hear of some of the kinds of details that I heard, but didn't in fact know all of this history before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I will say that I'm in my 30s as as context, and grew up in the US in St. Louis. And I will say that I don't believe I learned about Chinatowns almost at all. So there you go. Yeah, and certainly learned very little about Chinese history beyond maybe the Chinese Exclusion Act and the railroads. So not much happened. Ivan, I'm excited to hear from you. Go for it.
Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying Guin Fat Choi. In Hawaii, we all celebrate Chinese New Year. I grew up very near our Chinatown. For us, Chinatown was the place you avoided because it was too dangerous.
Wow.
It was quite notorious, a place. I was surprised at the film because I had no idea that there were Chinatowns in those cities. I've been to Boston, Chicago, and DC, and not once did I come across those Chinatowns. So just the fact of their existence was a surprise to me.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
All right. Next up, we have Luke.
So something that I think I learned or stood out to me was how economics can just sort of trump over justice or people's well-being and just kind of crush communities. So I thought there was like a good example of that in the film that helped me like see it and not just like think in my head, but experience how it happened to people's lives.
Thank you. Thank you. Edward, very rural Virginia. I like your label, man. Oh no, where did Edward go?
Thank you.
Oh, there you go.
I just got out of the shower. I look funny. I'm from the real South. We talk funny too, so you'll have to try to listen carefully. Of course, I'm quite familiar with the DC Chinatown. My husband and I had a great week at an Airbnb in the heart of Chinatown in New York City recently. That was fun. But my main thought and contribution here is how resilient Chinese people are, creative and successful in business, and all around the world in a diaspora. You can find a Chinese restaurant run successfully by Chinese people in every little tiny southern town around here where I live. And we can say that about, I'm sure, many other states and many other countries. So my thought is that Chinese people are successful in so many ways. And I'm sorry that the Chinatown is not successful in some places. There are complex reasons for that. But Chinese people and their families, I think, in general, are very creative and successful people and families. So if they want to restore Chinatown, I'm sure they would do that. But if they're feeling successful and happy in the diaspora, in their business enterprises and family and culture, that's fine too. That's my thought.
Okay, so from your perspective, the state of Chinatowns now in terms of population emptying, or just, having like policy aside, you're thinking people would go there, would come back if they wanted it. So take I hadn't thought about. Liz, go for it.
So another little thing that surprised me is that I had never consciously heard the term Taishanese before, and looked it up, and a significant part of the immigration of Chinese to the US came from Taishan, which is part of Guangdong province. But I felt like, I've heard of Gujarati and many of the subgroups of Indian immigrants, and we've heard of all of the different places that people come from in Europe, but how sort of like amorphous in my exposure that category of Chinese immigrants has been.
Thank you. since there are no other hands, we'll move on in a moment. I was just going to say that I feel like I learned about the civil rights movement in school, studied different movements on my own, and I had never learned that Chinese immigrants were part of the civil rights movement in terms of fighting for their own communities' rights. So that was totally new to me. And I was actually pretty sad to hear that Chinatown in DC had shrunk so much. I didn't realize that had gone through so much change. So yeah, but good to see people were fighters. Clearly, no community was totally going down, shrinking without a fight. Well, we are going to move on to the next question, which is coming from Donna.
Okay, so if this question applies to you, what is your personal relationship to, or where does your personal interest in this film come from? So if there's something that really struck you about the Chinatowns in these three cities that you know of, or any other Chinatown that you feel close to, tell us about that.
Don't be shy.
Well, darn it, I'll start. So I live in Northern Virginia, and I go into the Chinatown area of Washington, D.C. Whenever I want to go to the art gallery. There's a Smithsonian double museum in one building, which is both the Museum of American Art as well as the Museum of biographical images. And then also there are various theaters that are in that area. So I go there. Do I eat dinner at a Chinese restaurant? No, because there aren't any obvious ones right on the street level, right? There's a Tony Roba's, there's a Potbelly Sub, there's a tapas, Spanish tapas, but there aren't any really visible Chinese restaurants there. But doggone, they all have got Chinese names outside their business establishments because that's mandated by law. So it's a beautiful, very prettified Chinatown. It's got this really beautiful Chinese arch, and the names in Chinese. It really it's pretty, and it's entirely Disneyfied, and I just feel really weird about it. That it doesn't strike me as a gosh, what do I call it? A real Chinatown anymore. So Marlene. Marlene, you want to?
I'm a retired public school K-8 teacher with a history. I can teach multiple subjects, but I have a history degree from UCSD. So my personal interest is ethnic studies, and obviously the story of the Chinese immigration and its current immigration and how that impacts our communities as a whole is what drives me to come to this meeting. The biggest thing is that I'm seeing in the history of Chinese immigration is that what happened in the 1870s, 50s with the railroad, and then how they built through the mining and built San Francisco and other towns. That's a whole different history of how the contribution they made to the building of America. Today, the contribution is obviously the ancestry of the descendants have all kind of merged, and they try to maintain those who had the ability to try to maintain, because some of the people talking are like my age. They remember living in Chinatown and trying to maintain that close community with the school, with the stores, with the businesses, with the playground and friends. But obviously through gentrification and the need for investment capital to grow in the real estate market, and as well as commercialism, they took apart those communities and dispersed many of the people, many of the communities throughout the United States. And so there's a history, like in LA Chinatown, they wanted to put a Walmart in Chinatown, LA, and there was a big demonstration. They wanted, and many of the seniors have lost homes and are trying to get affordable housing and struggling to survive. And so, and then in San Diego, there's no more Chinatown at all, but now we have the Convoy area where there's a lot of restaurants. And then there's a Filipino community that where most of the Filipinos live, but it's integrated with other. So there's a lot of integration that has gone on. But I see a new development with the recent immigrants from China. They tend to be high professionals, tech, and really well off. So there's a class difference with the new immigration. So we're finding some conflict between the Asian community that's relatively supporting low-cost housing and a community versus the new immigrants. Like in my community, they got rid of the Black superintendent because she mentioned that the Chinese community in the district were well-off Chinese, and they didn't like to be identified as that. So there's a whole discussion about deaggregation of data of Asian Americans. You can't look at it as one amorphous group. They're very distinct in their cultures, they're distinct in their class, and their contribution to America.
Yeah, thank you, Marlene. That's something my husband was just saying to me, and we've lived in Asia ourselves for 9 years, but in terms of the immigrants these days from various Asian countries, you know, and I hate to come back to the mass shootings, but the other one in Half Moon Bay was of farm workers who were mainly Asian, and that there's an amazing income disparity within the Asian community of people who have done quite well and people who are struggling to make it, depending on what country they come from and how long they've been here and what kind of support system they have, which is interesting. Anybody else? I'm not seeing any more hands up. No? Okay. That's fine. I'm going to turn it over to Ron now.
Unmute, unmute.
Sorry about that. Marlene, some of the things that you had said leads right into this question. I mean, and I think a lot of people can contribute to it. So the question is then, who is Chinatown for? Think about that, you know, and think about it like who would visit Chinatown and think of it like that, but who is it for? You know? Anyone want to take that on? If not, Ronald talk. There we go. Is that Lisa?
Leslie.
Leslie. I'm sorry, Leslie. Go ahead, Leslie.
I teach at a university, and I have a bunch of students who've started what they're calling interest groups that are basically affinity groups. It started with Black students who said, you know, we need to be able to find people who look like us. And then that sort of spiraled. And so there's lots of student groups now for people who share some important element of identity. And what I love that they've done is they have said, this is a place for us to find our people and for us to share our culture with the larger student community. So instead of seeing themselves as like, we're a group that needs protection because we're a minority, they saw themselves as we're a group that has something to offer the rest of the students. And so there is an element of like, we want to be with people who share our experience, but there's also an element of we recognize the value of the diversity that we offer to the larger student community. And so now in the current culture that we have, I would hope that ethnic enclaves would have a similar viewpoint, that, you know, it's not a ghetto where we're separated. It's a place where we have that community and where on our own terms, we can invite in the rest of the community to learn and to share and to grow.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Edward, I see your hands up.
Thank you. So one thing that I was reminded of, a person earlier talked about their experience growing up where the Chinatown near where they grew up was a place you wouldn't go because it was dangerous. So I think it's important to remember complete histories. And I understand that history of Chinatowns around the country, perhaps other countries too, include that they were places where a nexus and a funnel for labor trafficking, because newly arrived Chinese people who did not know English, did not know the culture, could easily be taken there at one point off the ship, and in our own time off the airplane, and they or you either find themselves there or actually be taken there. And I've actually seen this in the past in Washington, Chinatown, big job announcement signs all over the windows. Those could be funnels. Historically, they have been, perhaps they still are, because I still think there's a lot of labor trafficking of Chinese nationals who come to the country, as well as other people. So that's a part of the ecology of Chinatowns and perhaps other language minority centers, labor trafficking.
So you're saying it was maybe a hub for dangerous things like labor trafficking
Absolutely.
and stuff? Oh,
Absolutely.
okay.
I think that's well known. Thank you.
All right, good. Anyone else would like to chime in on that? Because, you know, the reason why I was one that posed that question, and I always, when I went to New York City, the first place I always wanted to go to was Chinatown and Harlem. And you know, I'm learning something myself, you know, about the negative side of, because I looked at it as real positive. I would marvel at the restaurants in Chinatown and the food and the things. And then in Harlem, I would visualize myself going to music and writers. And so I guess I asked a question geared toward the positive side, but it's okay to give the negative as well. But anyway, Liz, how about you?
Well, one more response I wanted to make about it's a dangerous place was, at least in Boston, they talked about that the redlining sort of deliberately put Chinatown in the same place as what in Boston is called the combat zone, the place where prostitution was tolerated. So there was sort of a not on purpose on the part of the Chinese residents, geographic proximity there that would be liable to bring more crime and stuff like that. But the two other points I wanted to make, Chinatowns are also for tourists, for people who want to go eat Chinese food. And that's, you know, it has that role of sharing the culture in the positive ways that someone else talked about. It also brings dollars into the community. I mean, I think my hope is that residents of Chinatown are very happy to have non-Chinese people coming and visiting and have that tourist component. And one more function that hasn't been explicitly mentioned is that being a first stop in a positive way for new immigrants who may not speak English much. And you know, we saw examples of several of the social service agencies and English as a foreign language classes and services that the Chinatowns could offer to new immigrants to help them with settlement.
Thank you very much. Well, it looks like we have another hand up, Edward again.
I just want to reflect that unless you're labor trafficked to be the manager of the labor trafficking, you don't have to traffic people. So my other thought about the importance of Chinatowns is that, and what I very much miss, is that they have often been centers for people to explore, to visit a Taoist temple or a Buddhist shrine or to go to a place to learn traditional medicine or to seek traditional Chinese medicine. And those are wonderful gifts of Chinese people to our society. And because those places may not have a safe and happy home now in Chinatown or some other place, we certainly miss them. I certainly miss those opportunities to, say, visit a Taoist temple or Buddhist shrine or meet with people who understand traditional Chinese medicine. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Edward. I mean, that brings, so exposing people to other religions and then medical, which Ron can use quite a bit, especially some of the herbs, the natural herbs that heal my body. Oh, well. Anyway, Catherine has another question. How about that?
Well, I was talking to my spouse about her experience with Chinatown. Her father came to the United States from China in 1955 and lived in DC and ran a restaurant. And they didn't go to Chinatown as a family very much. Her father went, but they were trying to, assimilate. And they lived in there were a lot of different communities to learn to get along with. But her father went to Chinatown as a resource to go to the grocery stores to get the ingredients for the restaurant. So back then that was what, Chinatown could be a hub for groceries that would be authentic and needed. I checked about Chicago. I mean, from the film, I couldn't quite remember, but the Chinatown in Chicago has been there since 1912, so over 100 years. I mean, it's very unfortunate it had to be relocated, and I'm sure that was very disruptive and painful for the people at the time, but now it's been there for quite a long time. And when we used to pass through and stop there in Chinatown with my daughter, who's from China, it was a place where she could pick up, she could buy things, cultural Chinese things. She participated with the Chinese American Association of Minnesota in Chinese dance. And so she could find things for costumes or for her hair or, things from her culture as she was growing up. So I think it was a way for her, and then she could go to restaurants and be in a place where so many people looked like her. We found that in Minnesota too. There's no Chinatown here, but with the dance theater and the Chinese Association and then the festivals, that provided a great opportunity for my daughter, who is Chinese, to get immersed in her culture, and for my spouse too. Anyway, so I just think it's a nice connecting and touch point in this time, as well as, like other people have said, for me, I've learned a lot. I'm not Chinese, but from them and the experience.
Thank you, Catherine. And then we'll finish up on this question with Molly. How you doing, Molly?
Hey, Ron, it's good to see you always.
Yeah.
I loved what was that Catherine who just spoke? Yeah, I love what Catherine said, because there's clearly a personal resonance with making sure your children, if they are Chinese or even partly Chinese, that they know that there's a place here that was tied to their heritage, even if it's gentrified or people have been basically kicked out and so on. And my comment ties into that idea that in terms of retaining the historical ties of a place so that people knew what was, almost like you see a plaque when you walk around Philadelphia, let's say, or other cities where there's a lot of rich American history, a plaque that this happened on this spot. I think that's actually an argument for having up the names of businesses, for instance, in DC. This was something Donna had wondered last week. Is it necessary? Like, should the DC government really continue to mandate that businesses display names in Chinese? And I guess the question really here is that for the tourists at this point, or is it for people just to know that this was here once, like sort of like a, like when someone writes their name in a tree and says Molly was here, is it just for the historical resonance? I think it's also for people like, Catherine, your spouse, and your daughter, to see that their heritage is there. And I'll give the one example that's specific to my own background is I really love going to the Tenant Museum in New York City. It's one of my favorite places to visit. And that ties into my background, because when my relatives moved to Lower East Side, they were in these tenement houses. That's just a museum now, I mean, there were literally, I think, 7,000 Jewish and German and Italian immigrants who passed through this one tenement house. Even if it's just knowing like this group was here at some point, it means that, that you get to know that there was a history here that somehow, that for some reason is gone now. And I think, I hate to say it that way because there is still a DC Chinatown. It's a few hundred people versus a few thousand. But I think it's important to like memorialize the cultures that were in different parts of a city, just like we memorialize that, the Constitution was written in this spot, right? Like that, like, why is it less or more important to memorialize, some of our founders' history? I think entire cultures moved into these cities and they were forced out or chose to be out. So that's what I'm going to put in a plug for. So that even if it is for who are someone, it's also for people to come back and see, yes, this is part of my personal history.
Thank you. Thank you, Molly, for actually ending on the historical piece too, because, it ties into the question as well. It's like studying the different communities also, even though they start off as being a negative thing, segregating different cultures, ethnicities, it helps us understand how the events in those past, think about it, make us in a melting pot of America, and it's like nowhere in the world is there a situation like this, even though it was negative, and how we are today. So anyway, the next question, I'll turn it over to, help me guys, who's on the next
To Janelle. Janelle, you are next. And the question is in the chat.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if she's able to, her camera's off. So Janelle, if you're able to turn on your mic and ask the question, go for it. Otherwise, one of us I can handle it if need be.
Yeah.
Going once, going twice. Okay, yeah, she may not be able to talk right now. So, okay, her kid is sick. I understand. So I will just lead with the next question. I was really interested in how these Chinatowns turned out differently. And I think because I wasn't in a class setting and couldn't analyze it with a whole group, this is my class setting right here. So the question I want to throw out there is, which policies and events led to different outcomes for the three Chinatowns in the film? So why did these Chinatowns have unique outcomes specifically, based on either policy or events? So if you haven't seen the film in a little while, this might be hard to remember, but just to jog your memory, there was different forms of activism. There was the issue with, oh gosh, what do you call it? With the highways cutting through different Chinatowns. At one point there were people fighting to keep a building, and then they got to keep, I think it was like half the building. So that's just jogging your memory. I don't want to answer the question for people, but again, just which policies and events led to different outcomes for the Chinatowns, and why do you think that, we have such extreme examples of some Chinatowns retaining a fair amount of Chinese population, like in the thousands, and they said DC was down to 300. That's pretty dramatic. Don't see any hands raised, so I'm just gonna let people think for a moment. Oh, go for it, Joan.
They did emphasize that without residents, there's no support. Without support, there's no community. And they lose what they had then. I think this was especially true of the DC Chinatown, whereas Chicago somehow pulled together, got political agency, and maintained their and even expanded their Chinatown. And actually, I visited the Chicago Chinatown. I found it was a delightful place to visit, very interesting. I remember it being very attractive and very clean. So.
Thank you for sharing that. I had actually forgotten how much the leaders in Chicago really came together. Marlene, go for it.
I lived in Chicago in the 80s and early 90s. I haven't seen the Boston, or I've been to Boston, but I didn't get to see the Chinatown, and I've been to DC, but I never got to see DC. So I come from California, so I relate more to San Francisco, LA, and San Diego. But I don't think the policies and events that led to the outcomes of these three Chinatowns in the film are that much different than most Chinatowns in communities, and even connecting to the African-American community like Tulsa, Oklahoma, though that was definitely a very difficult history of segregation from slavery on to Reconstruction to extreme white supremacy. I'm sure Chinatowns have also gone through that history of white supremacy. To me, the key thing is the policies of eminent domain, where governments felt like these people don't have any power or say in government, and so we're going to take their land because they're not going to complain. So we're going to run a highway across and break up the community. That's very common throughout the United States, and we can cite many examples. Like in San Diego alone, the community of the Chicano Mexican community just got cut right in half, and so they've been divided, and they come back to try to rebuild their barrio and community, and but that freeway just and it's also left. They also push them into areas that have high pollution rates and industrialization. So as if you grew up in the 40s and 50s, it was nice and clean and wonderful. And as you got to the 60s, 70s, the communities were dispersed and cut up and their culture lost, but dispersed. So also redlining that occurred in this century, that said, okay, if you're Chinese, Black, Hispanic, you're only going to be in this red area, and the white people get to have these nice communities. And so that's part of the outcome of what we have today.
Thank you, Marlene. I'm glad you flagged that. An important part was from, I think it was, in Boston, that the community was relocated, part or all of it, to an area that was pretty unsafe. And then some people were probably moving just to escape the violence. And then honestly, like, people also had high rents that were pushing them out. That was a risk too. Catherine, go for it. Love to hear from you again.
I just had an observation about Chicago. I lived in Chicago for 3 years in the 80s, and I was working for the Catholic Church for the Ministry of Peace and Justice, and we were funding community organizations working to make systemic change in neighborhoods. And a thing that I learned about Chicago, which I think is interesting in light of a thriving Chinatown there, is that there seemed to be a sense of community, but there were also clear neighborhoods. There was, the Mexican neighborhood. There were neighborhoods that were primarily Black, but then there were neighborhoods that were Polish. There were neighborhoods that were Irish. There were neighborhoods that were Italian. And so people hung on to identity, quite a range and mixture. And of course, some identities more privileged than others, and out in the suburbs thing became a little bit more blended or less clear. But I was really impressed with Chicago as a place where people had this sense of, I'm Italian and I hang out with other Italian people. And so there might be a respect for, oh, you're German and you hang out with other German people. This is Chinatown. So maybe that's part of why Chinatown thrives in Chicago. It's one of many specific neighborhoods. Anyway, so that was something. I'm not an expert and I haven't lived in Chicago for a while, but I was really struck by that long ago when I did live there.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, retaining the character or culture of a neighborhood by basically sticking with people like you, which I think sometimes we can paint insularity as a negative, but in your case, you're saying it builds community, which is a positive. So thank you. And Luke, you're next, and then you're up on deck, Ron.
Yeah, lots of hands just went up. I remember in the movie saying very specifically that the Chicago area was left alone because there weren't competing interests trying to get into it. And so my takeaway is that it's development of non-Asian peoples that buy up the land, take out the money, rent to higher income non-Asians, and that's a lot of what destroys communities. So I guess that's gentrification and development by people who aren't of that community.
Thank you. Ron, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, in that movie, it did talk about the highways coming through, and I just reflected, because I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I lived in the projects. And I remember when playing in I-75, when they came smack right through the community, and it really destroyed a sense of community, social, everything that was going on. And then next year, you know, my cousins and my friends, they were living somewhere else. And then it was so hard to get together with them on a regular basis. And so I kind of reflected on it. But then again, I think, didn't Congress in November just pass passed a bill to address that what happened during the freeways going through, and I guess they gave, what is it, $1 billion or something like that, I forget, or more. It might have been some more money. I'm kind of conservative in those areas, but when it comes to social issues, I tend to think, okay, let's try to do something about it. And so that was kind of struck me and is a positive for America.
What was it that they were doing something about it? You mean in terms of fighting back against the highway issue, Ron?
Yeah, the highways, you know, when the highways went through and demolished, you know, kind of destroyed the community, is what I'm saying. And then in November, I think they passed a infrastructure for highways. And part of that bill, they were addressing what had happened back in the 50s, especially in Boston. You know, when they brought Highway 93, I think, in, and another highway. And so, you know, even though it's a heavy price tag and we all got to pay for it, I think to me it's a positive, you know.
Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know. I've lived in Boston for years. I didn't know that history about Boston and Highway 93. Roy, you are next, and then Joan, you'll probably wrap up our answers to this question. So Roy, go for it.
Sure, yeah, just in reaction to an earlier comment. Can you hear me? You can hear me.
Yeah, I can. You just moved really suddenly, so I thought you were dropped.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're great. It was Zoom, not you.
So my family is Brooklyn, and all four of my grandparents in through Ellis Island waved at the Statue of Liberty, signed the book, and settled in areas that spoke their language. And I think that's a big part of all of this, is that a lot of the origin of older cities is transition zones. It's just way more comfortable to get to a place where, oh my God, I don't have to speak English 24/7 when I don't know English. Like, and you're speaking a language that you're familiar with, you're seeing styles and dress and food and culture that you're familiar with. And, you know, so what my point is, I think a lot of the older cities have organic Chinatowns. It is migration transition platforms, like an Italian neighborhood, like an Arabic neighborhood, like a Hebrew neighborhood, like, you know, the areas where people of like birds of a feather flock together. Then I think the younger cities, I do believe that Chinatown becomes more of it's less of a transition spot, and it's more of a novelty place. It's more of a cultural exchange, and it's also more of a way for a savvy entrepreneur to start making money by selling Chinese food and having, you know, the look of the buildings, the architecture, and everything, make it more of a destination versus a transition zone. And I do think that we need to distinguish a little bit in that regard. It could happen, by the way, the road coming through and all the horrible things that you hear about could happen in either case. But I think the origin story of some of our Chinatowns needs to be recognized and needs to be recognized. I mean, in Brooklyn, it's not just Chinatown. As Ron said, there's Harlem for some jazz and some music, and we have neighborhoods, and most of them happen organically because people of a type. There's a theater district, and there's an Italian neighborhood, and you go into the north end of I'm outside Boston. You go to the north end to get Italian food. Everybody knows that. Like, you know, concentrations of themes just makes sense for humans, you know, and it's horrible when it gets broken up. But anyway, I just want to say that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you think what you're speaking is basically like the network effects. People who are like each other, tend to find each other and also help each other out too. And Joan, you are
And
up.
you can have the negative effect, as I think Edward was saying, like you do get, trafficking in that regard, because people take advantage of their own people. They don't speak English. I do speak English. I can take advantage of them in the transition. I mean, it's not all positive, but I am saying that when you go to older cities, you find more of these towns of like meeting like, because it tends to be an immigrant landing zone. It's a transition zone for immigrants coming into the United States.
Yeah, thank you for the term immigrant landing zone. That was funny. I will say some of it's by choice and some of it's not, as we learned too. It's a mix in the movie for sure. Joan, you're up. And then actually, Leslie, we'll take you as the last one for this question.
I think one of the things tangentially to what Ron said and what about the people have, I guess, that are successful, what kind of debt do they owe to the community to sustain the community? Like they did point out that in one area, the people who were buying the buildings and changing them were Chinese, but they were successful Chinese. They felt no obligation to help the people who had no place to live after they raised the rent. So I thought that was an important consideration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And Leslie, you're up.
I like that idea about the transition zone, because the immigrants come in waves and then they adapt to the US, their children are educated, and then their children or grandchildren don't want to go into the same job. So I'm thinking about how many wonderful Chinese restaurants there used to be in Manhattan, and now it's really hard outside of Chinatown to find them. But it's actually a good thing from that point of view of that community, because their kids all went to college and are not going to do the brutal hours that we require at ethnic restaurants. And most ethnic restaurants aren't able to charge the kind of money that would make that a good living, because we don't pay well unless it's French or maybe Greek now these days. And so the idea of a transition zone, I'm also thinking, I used to live in Philadelphia and the neighborhood was Jewish, and then it was Italian, and it was becoming Cambodian, like it was, because there are these different waves of immigrants. And what would happen is that they would all move out to the suburbs, living the American dream. So that idea of change and progress, like I'm really sad to see where policies had an impact on destroying communities that were not ready to move out. But I'm also recognizing that communities that did want to move out and live out of the city, living the American dream with more space and whatever, that's actually a good thing, even though it's a loss for the rest of us. So I'm still back to that idea of, the two perspectives, us and the people in those communities, that our desires and needs may differ.
Yeah, I think I'll point to two aspects of what we're saying. I know this is oversimplifying, but it's almost like in some cases, people were forced to live in certain areas because they weren't allowed to live in other areas, but then they were forced out of those areas, or in some cases felt they needed to move out. There were points that I want to say, like, I almost felt like a reframing of the American dream was in order, because people liked living in, a fairly packed apartment building with, people they knew down the street who they also were going to school with or working with, like it was such a tight knit community, that's what I felt the loss of in some of the places. I'm going to go back and what I said, and we'll allow one more person, because Catherine, you happen here and you haven't actually spoken yet. I love to, I think that's a Catherine I haven't spoken. Yeah, who hasn't spoken yet. Is that right? Oh, yeah, go for it. And then we'll actually switch questions as soon as you go.
Okay. One of the things that they brought up about the Chicago Chinatown was the large park. And that reminded me that in San Francisco, we also have a large park. I mean, it's not huge, but what's really interesting about it, it's where the people can gather and they played their games, or they just talk, or do Tai Chi. But the tourists also would come into the parks because they were so interested in all that. And they like sitting there, just being part of that. And so it was a wonderful nonverbal way share the joys of culture. So maybe that's an ingredient for most immigrant communities, is to have a place like that. Then there's a common interest among the people living there, the immigrants, and the tourists, to keep that place safe.
Definitely. I think what you're saying is the importance of public open spaces. And I think that's a totally new angle we hadn't covered yet. Well, that ended up being a very rich, detailed discussion of the question of why there were different outcomes, and also what makes a community tick and what makes a community, be able to share itself with other people. I'm going to turn it over to Ivan now to take us to kind of like a higher level question. And Ivan, go for it.
Thanks, Molly. We've kind of talked about this subject too, but let's tackle it directly, which is gentrification. Under what circumstances should government come in and either reduce or stop gentrification? And I guess I'll start with a contrary view. If you don't have gentrification, what happens to the neighborhood? It gets older and older, starts to fall apart. Is gentrification a necessary thing to keep the physical plant renewed? What happens, as we saw in some of these Chinatowns profiled in the film? What happens when the gentrifiers are themselves Chinese who are becoming successful? Here in Honolulu, as I mentioned, the Chinatown was notorious for being dangerous. It's still kind of a marginal district. If the owners of the land are Chinese families, which they are, do you want to encourage them to gentrify the neighborhood because it is in a precarious state? Or are you going to be always reliant on government to come in and be the renewer of the neighborhood, be the supplier of money to fix it up because the neighborhood wants Chinatown more than the Chinatown inhabitants want it? It's kind of a difficult question. Anybody want to jump in on that? Luke, I think I saw your hand first.
I want to voice interest in the communities that live there have a voice in the kind of gentrification or development that's happening.
Yeah, we had about 20, 30 years ago, we had a group organized because there was some development going on, redevelopment going on, and they were at least ostensibly representing the residents of Chinatown. And they slowed the gentrification process. The project went ahead anyway. Right now, it's one of the few better kept buildings because of that. And meanwhile, the rest of the Chinatown area is very much up for grabs. I don't know who was next. Joan, how about you?
Well, what you just said addresses again the same question about what kind of obligation do the people who have the means to improve the buildings, then do they have an obligation to the community to provide some lower or middle class housing that's affordable? Otherwise, those people get squeezed out. But on the other hand, they have been successful and they have a right to charge the market price for their buildings. So it's a dilemma.
Yeah. And I would say that, in Honolulu, and I'm sure it's true in the other cities that were profiled, construction is very expensive. And you have a lot of regulations limiting the height, the density, the nature of the redevelopment. So it's not an attractive area for redevelopment. And yet the need is there for something to go on, otherwise the building will fall apart. Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine Lecce Chong's husband, Curtis Chong, and I grew up here in San Francisco, born here. My grandfather was the first generation, came here from Canton. But what I wanted to talk about was to address what you were saying about policies and stuff. So, of course, he came to Chinatown here in San Francisco for the same reasons that we heard everybody talk about here. And my mom and her sister and brother were all born here in San Francisco in Chinatown. And it served that nucleus, like what everybody was talking about, where, their grandma who never spoke English could have a safe place. What's interesting about Chinatown today, and I had to do a little homework on this because I don't, you live here, but you never think about these things. But the truth is San Francisco's Chinatown is only 20 square blocks. Of that 20 square blocks, and what I just took a look at, there are the median age of the residents here is 50 years old. Okay, that's a pretty old age. That wasn't the age my grandfather came over, but that's because he was part of the first generation. So that tells you something about, it's not new immigrants coming over here in Chinatown now in San Francisco. The other thing you should know is that the median income is $20,000 in Chinatown, which is the median income in San Francisco is 76. So that's telling you about the kind of people who are living there and how much money they're earning. And of that, it's 15,000 residents live in those 20 square blocks, which is it's 7 times higher than any other place in San Francisco. So it's a very dense area. So when we walk through San Francisco and you see Chinatown and you see all the restaurants, everything, what you should look at is everything above it, because all of those are actually hotels. We call them SROs, single resident occupancy hotels. I'm an architect and we did a lot of work in SROs, and I worked with a group in Chinatown that did work to help with the, housing and helping the residents and protect their rights and things like that. But what I want to say was, what's interesting, what's changed Chinatown now, I believe, is the policy for rent control. So we have rent control now for buildings prior to 1970 when you rented. So as somebody said here, the homes, the buildings are owned by mostly Chinese, yes, but they can't sell them now because as the parents die, now it's the kids who own it. They don't want to live there in Chinatown anymore. They don't want to own the property down there, but they can't sell it because it has no value because it's all under rent control. So there's this really strange thing where it's not being gentrified at all, if you ask me, in San Francisco Chinatown. I can't speak for the other Chinatowns, but I do think that's what's going on here. Sorry, it took me a little bit longer to get to that answer.
No. Your story is very similar to the Honolulu situation. I have written grants for this arts organization for our Chinatown, and I had to do research about the area. Our Chinatown has the lowest income of any place in the island. It also has probably the same kind of demographic in terms of age. And nobody wants to live there. It's an undesirable place to live. So the families that own the property, they don't want to, redevelop for their own residents. So all the economic activity is shifting over to bars, restaurants, non-Chinese restaurants largely, although it's still in the Pacific Rim type of cuisine. It's all very similar, except we don't have rent control. I think that is at least giving us some reason for hope that private redevelopment will come here. Edward. How about you?
Hi, thank you. So as in most cities, the decisions are driven by land values, and that's informed by zoning and who controls zoning. And another big issue is how people get around. So example, Washington. It's easy to get there because the subway gets there, but I kept wondering why they allowed through zoning there to be a huge movie complex that didn't contribute anything really to other than, I mean, they could get there easily on the subway. And I suppose the idea was that, well, maybe they'll go and eat in the Chinatown restaurant and go to a movie. But that's not good employment for the people who live in Chinatown, who might want to live there and have a better living than just working in a restaurant. So bad zoning and bad planning. So that's just one example. Now, I think perhaps in Chicago, if I understood that situation well, the land values stabilized and weren't dropping, in part because it was adjacent to other neighborhoods where people might transit in and out of Chinatown for various services or enjoyment or entertainment. At the same time, the people that live there could get good services. They could go to a full service grocery store or some other amenity to make life a good quality of living in a city. So that might be an example of the zoning and who controls the zoning. And somebody mentioned the participation of the community in the zoning decisions. If those are done well, then we could see Chinatowns or any other such places prosper. I worry though, when I gave that example of Washington and the movie, it's almost as if the planners were thinking of it as a kind of ethnic getaway trip for the weekend or the afternoon or the evening. That really is treating the Chinese people who live there and work there as a kind of exotic entertainment. And that's very troubling to me. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's close out this question with Marlene.
The question, under what circumstances, if any, ought the government to step in to slow gentrification? Again, coming from California, the top 10, of the top 10 cities who are facing housing shortage and the highest cost of housing, 8 of them are in California. And so when we talk about government stepping in, I mean, I don't know if how many of you have gone to LA recently. It has really, it's 40,000 people are out on the streets right now in LA and suffering. My son saw a little 2-year-old running in the street, and he tried to get help to get this child shelter. It's just terrible. So I think when we talk about Chinatowns, we can't separate it from the overall history of our nation right now, is that private businesses and private investors, and many of them are from China, are buying up these communities and just chalking up the rent all over, particularly in California. And so there's got to be some kind of plan where we become more humane about just not, you know, I don't know, letting them sleep out on the street. We really do need to find affordable housing solutions. And that's going to require government and the people to say, hey, we need a better society. We can't just continue to grow the homeless. And those, we need to give them the support they need and find solutions, and not just let the billionaires take over the land and just throw people out on the streets.
All right. Thanks, Marlene. I'll turn it over now to Donna.
Okay, so my question is, what does this film tell us about what happens when ethnic groups in the United States obtain or do not obtain political power? This question got me thinking about the Irish in Boston. The Irish, of course, coming as immigrants and being discriminated against and being insulted, biased, etc. And they obtained political power, and they moved into the police force. And then the Irish in Boston suddenly were a force to be reckoned with because they realized how important the politics was. But what about Asian folks in this film? Liz.
I hate to keep just raising my hand to fill voids, but I think it was in the Chicago example that they showed a very deliberate process of tapping people to please start participating in things and being politically active, because once you have some political visibility and power, then you have a seat at the table. Then instead of people just making decisions about your community without your input, you can drive the majority around you to listen to you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Chicago politics reigns supreme, right? So they learned how to play the game in a sense. Phyllis, how about you?
I grew up in Chicago. I live in a suburb now of Chicago. I'm in my 70s, so I've been here my whole life. And hearing you all talk about it, I thought, well, maybe I should say something as a native. You're all making very good points about it. We do have our neighborhoods and all that. We have a lot of Mideastern, Mideast people, but also Eastern Europeans moving in also now. I hear what you're saying oftentimes, though. You know, you need to get, you know, the Irish came and they worked their way in, and I'm Italian, the Italians worked their way up. My father was actually born in Italy, so he came here. What I see, though, and what I try to explain to people that give this argument, you can change your name, which a lot of people have done, so that you blend in more. But Asians and brown, Black people, they walk in a room, they cannot blend in like you're saying, well, just, you know, get involved in politics, become a police officer, work your way up, do what the Irish did, do what the Italians did. They can't walk into a room and change their appearance. They can change their name, they can learn English better than you and I speak it, but they've always got that barrier. And I think we, especially those of us here tonight who are white, whether we're from, you know, European or wherever, you know, we have to remember they can walk into any room and they will always know they're a little different if they're in the minority there. And I don't know how many of you have gone into places where you are the minority with your white skin. My daughter-in-law is African-American, and when I do things with her side of the family, my son and I are the only Caucasian white people there. So I know what that feels like, to walk in and immediately you're getting judged. So I understand why these communities want to band together like that. It's not only language, but it's your whole culture and everything is, you don't feel foreign there. And And so it's good that they have communities, but they should also be welcomed everywhere. And it's hard for them. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. No, you're making a really, really good point.
Yeah, I just, one other point, and I kind of lost it. I'm sorry, I'm getting senile in my old age, I think. But I like having grown up in Chicago. I'm now in a suburb for the last 6 years, and it's all basically, you know, white, and I don't like it, which is why I like Braver Angels, and I'm also in a progressive book club on Zoom. I miss the ethnic, I miss the cultures of having grown up in Chicago, and I worked in a very multi-culture environment with people from all over the world, a lot of immigrants, and I miss that. So, you know, anyways, that's all I want to say. Just Chicago it's a good place, but yeah, the gentrification has definitely changed whole neighborhoods, chased a lot of people out. They can't afford it. I can't even afford to live in a lot of areas of Chicago anymore. So
yeah, understood.
That's about all I wanted to say, but thank you for listening.
Thank you. Yeah. Now in DC, of course, they destroyed the old Chinatown when they decided to put up these massive federal government buildings. It moved north. And then now, as we hear, there are just 300 people left. So what happened to Asian people in the DC environment, in case anybody's interested? They moved to the suburbs, and many of them are doing quite well. So where I live, which is not far from Dulles Airport, we have got, and even close to the city, very successful Southeast Asians, as well as Koreans. We have areas where, you know, people can go shopping and get Asian food. We have a lotte right by us. Part of that, a big part of that is because there's a big IT sector right where I live, and that's attracted people, all sorts of people, but in particular, some Asian people that are doing really well in IT. Now, Ron, you said you have something to say?
Yeah, almost. What is the question? Repeat the question.
So what does the film tell us about what happens when ethnic groups in the U.S. obtain or do not obtain political power?
That's a difficult one. I'll just try to answer it like this. And I call it my threshold of change. And I can understand wanting to have political power. At one time as a youth, I wanted to be a Black Panther. I went from there and nothing happened because most of them got arrested or shot or in prison and blah, blah, blah. And then I went to being a colorblind Negro or Black folk person. And that didn't work either because most people, they said just as Phyllis was saying, they see me, the elephant in the room, the only person that's Black, and they would remind me of that. So, and I hadn't matured. I look at it like this. It depends on your moral foundation, okay? And we all fall into different categories in your identity. I now identify as a child of God. And I say this, okay? If I continually have the mindset of Christ and I join a group that tries to say, Ron, make me the MLK, the Martin Luther King of all Black folks, I don't really want to be in that group anymore because they're just saying that every Black man speaks for every Black man. Just like, do you do that to yourself as an Asian person or a white person or a Latino? No, we all have voices. Is it important to find like Americans and join a group where you share the same philosophy? Yes. And I buy into, I understand the struggle. I understand the atrocities that happened back in the day, But I don't want to get smother those struggles where we cannot work together and have American change. We know the goofiness that went on. So I look at it like that. How am I going to resolve or help resolve, like Braver Angels tries to do? Get your perspectives and then come up with a common ground to try to change it. And it's going to take time because race is such an emotional thing. That's how I deal with it.
Thank you so much, Ron, for your wisdom from your lived experience. Really appreciate that. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Ivan. Ivan, this might be a good time to close this out, but I'll leave that up to you if you really want to ask a question. But otherwise, you can also tell us about the next movie. Please unmute, Ivan.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll start with a teaser about the next movie. We're going to change gears and talk about comedy. We have a movie scheduled that's called Can't We Take a Joke? And it's about how comedy clubs and certain comedy acts have been under assault from people who thought that such speech should not be allowed. So you can look for that next month. And I'll go on to the next question then. The next question is about how do non-Chinese people view Chinatown? When the Chinese came into Chinatown, they were a persecuted minority. So when they start moving out, is that an indication that they've outgrown Chinatown? And is that a bad thing or a good thing? When we look at places like DC and see that Chinatown is struggling to continue, is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? Is that a mark of their success? What do you think?
I think that's a really good question. And that's kind of what I opened up with. I mean, you say, wow, gentrification, but then people get pushed out. How do we find that median? I mean, I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Some people can work it out. And it seems like without that gentrification, you have to bring some money into the neighborhood. You know, I think that was mentioned earlier. So that's a good question. You know, I really don't know. I think that's what we're struggling to find right now. How do we find that? Bring it in, you know, to keep the community going and yet still keep not lose the culture of the community or the flavor of the community. But as I'm listening to all this, I just think that seems to be the American way, seems to be you come into that community and then you assimilate and your children marry in other cultures, and that seems to be what you do. It seems like the natural thing. And then you have okay, like, you know, my background is Irish and St. Patrick's Day, big deal. But, you know, I married an Italian, my daughter married a guy from Nigeria. My other daughter married a guy from Brazil. So, and I think that's wonderful. So, I mean, you want to hold on to that culture. And at the same time, it's so important to assimilate and see the beauty and the diversity and other things. So that's a good question. I don't know, but I think we need to keep asking ourselves that.
Yeah. It's also interesting for me to hear other people on this meeting talk about their Chinatowns and how it's maybe a way to find Chinese food. Here, there is no shortage of Chinese restaurants. You can find it pretty much anywhere. There is no need to, you know, for Chinatown to continue to remind people about Chinese culture. We have all kinds of Chinese festivals and other ethnic festivals. So it's sort of an interesting view for me to see how other places are, because you know, as Hawaii is a state, we were one of the first, or maybe the first, and continuing majority minority states, and we will probably continue to be that way. So there is no particular, and yet, sorry to be garbled, but at the same time that we have so many ethnic festivals, there is still strong attachment to different ethnic cultures without regard to having to channel that to a specific geography. Anyway, Molly, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll be really brief so that Marlene gets to jump in here. We have times. I know we're closing up on 9:30 Eastern. I'll just say two things that come to mind. First of all, I don't think that it's for anybody's, decision-making power to say whether this other group has outgrown Chinatown, other than people themselves who used to live there, other than those communities, because I do feel like that's part of the problem, is that these communities never owned their right of where exactly to live. First, they had to live in certain places, and then they were forced out of certain places. So I wouldn't want to step in and take that ownership over that decision. But to the second one, to me, like, the answer is so obvious here. You retain your community lending organization, or you retain your cultural organizations. You continue throwing cultural festivals that, if you want to educate people, are open to the broader public. Edward talked about people going in for an ethnic experience. I actually see it as a positive side if people come to watch Lunar New Year and come to feel part of that and say, like, oh, this is America too. And as someone who's a millennial, like, I learned that the better metaphor for America was never a melting pot, but a salad bowl, coexisting equally and each having some importance in that salad bowl. Like, I'll be the red pepper and I'm going to retain my identity, just like you over there as the, apple or whatever. I like apple and that. So my point is just to say that I really do believe that you retain it instead of geographically through organizations that promote cultural or religious or community events.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, we reject the idea of a melting pot too. And Marlene, how about closing us out?
Well, I wanted to recognize how we started it and giving our thoughts and prayers to the families who were killed this week in Monterey and in Half Moon Bay, and how it brings to mind the importance of community, of culture and support, and how maybe if these men had a community where they had facilities where if they had issues, they had a place to go with people they can relate to that might understand their issues, maybe we could ameliorate some mental illness that goes on, not just in Chinese communities, but all communities, where every community has access to social services and mental health and joy and culture and dance and art and sharing and sports within their culture, but also expanding and opening it up to people outside their culture. So I'm just thinking about how do we move on as America of all these beautiful cultures, and how do we enhance that, help each other, support each other, and move towards a more understanding and more support, particularly in these tough times of mental illness, COVID, lack of housing, not having a living wage. There's many issues that we need to tackle, but if we can find ways in our community to get government support as well as community support to get particularly mental health centers and social centers, outreach centers, maybe we can have a better world.
Yes, thanks, Marlene. We all are thinking about that kind of issue. Molly, you want to close us out here?
I mean, I think Marlene closed this out perfectly.
Yeah.
I mean, I can give some logistics, but Marlene, that was unbelievable. You should be a clergy member or something. Couldn't have said anything better myself. And it really is about like getting into communities and providing needed resources. And thank you so much for that. Thank you everyone for a really amazing discussion tonight. As you noticed, we were probably a little smaller. We had probably 50 people, about a little over 50 people register, and we're usually about half that. And so I will say that I really enjoyed the intimate, smaller discussion. And that being said, please recruit people for next time. As Ivan said, we have a film coming out in February. In a few weeks, we will notify you on the date of, well, not you directly, but we'll give you a heads up on the Braver Angels email as always, and on the events listing. And if you're not a Braver Angels member, think about joining. It took me a while and I finally joined, and it's only $12 a year minimum. It's always nice to donate more, but if you just join for $12 a year, that's incredible. So do think about joining. It's braverangels.org is the website. And if you have films to recommend, we do have a few on the plate probably for the next few months, but feel free to write one of us. I know my name is affiliated with the invite and I can pass that on, or other, if you have other people's emails, we do share those around. And Donna, am I forgetting anything? Because you usually do such a great job closing.
Well, actually, Ron is the one who usually reminds people to join Braver Angels, and you did a great job of
Thank
that.
you.
So congratulations.
Awesome. Okay, well, to more wonderful discussions, and come more often and bring friends. Thank you, everyone.